There is no warmth in a contract. Rowan knew this when he signed his life away to the Duke of Somerset. Henry Caldwell was a man made of frost and iron, an alpha who bought an omega simply to fulfill a bloodline quota. Rowan expected cold nights. He expected isolation. He expected to be a ghost in a sprawling, empty manor. What he didn't expect was the heavy, suffocating weight of an alpha who would burn the world down to keep him warm. The fountain pen scratched against the thick parchment. It sounded like a match striking in a quiet room. Rowan stared at his own signature. The ink was still wet, pooling slightly in the curve of the R. He had a slight tremor in his hand, a persistent, annoying flutter in his nerves that made his handwriting look childish. He placed the heavy gold pen back in its velvet groove. That was it. The sum total of 24 years of life, neatly appraised, itemized, and sold. £2 million. That was the price tag on an Omega with a weak constitution and a disgraced family name. It was enough to clear his father's gambling debts and keep his younger brother in university. It was enough to buy Rowan's absolute submission. "Is that satisfactory, Your Grace?" the solicitor asked. His voice was too loud, too eager. Rowan didn't look up immediately. He focused on his breathing. In, out. The air in the solicitor's office smelled of stale coffee, floor wax, and the overwhelming, suffocating scent of the alpha sitting directly across the mahogany desk. Henry Caldwell, the Duke of Somerset. Rowan finally lifted his eyes. Henry hadn't moved since they sat down. He was a large man, built with the kind of dense, unyielding muscle that tailored wool suits tried and failed to completely conceal. His hair was dark, cropped close at the sides, threading with premature silver at the temples. But it was his eyes that made people look away. They were a pale, flat gray, like a winter sky just before a freeze. "It will do," Henry said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated against the crystal tumblers on the side table. He didn't look at Rowan. He looked at the paper. Henry picked up his own pen, signed the document with 3 sharp, efficient strokes, and stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. "The car is waiting downstairs. Have your things brought down." "I have them here," Rowan said. His voice felt thin and brittle in his throat. Henry paused. He looked down at the single scuffed leather duffel bag resting by Rowan's feet. The alpha's brow furrowed slightly, a microscopic shift in the rigid architecture of his face. £2 million for the Omega, and the Omega was carrying his life in a bag held together by duct tape. "Very well," Henry said. He didn't offer to carry it. He turned and walked out the door. Rowan followed. His chest ached. It was a familiar dull throb behind his ribs. Stress always triggered it, a physical manifestation of his body's failure to produce the right hormones, the right resilience. He was a defective Omega. His scent was barely there, a weak, dusty smell like dried chamomile and old books. Most alphas found it off-putting. Henry apparently didn't care. Henry just needed a legal spouse on paper to secure his inheritance of the Somerset estate. They rode down the elevator in silence. The descent made Rowan's stomach turn. Outside, the London rain was coming down in sheets. A black town car idled by the curb, its headlights cutting through the gray afternoon. A driver in a dark uniform opened the rear door. Henry got in first. Rowan hesitated, clutching his bag to his chest, before sliding into the leather interior. The door shut. The silence inside the car was absolute, heavily soundproofed against the city traffic. Rowan pressed himself against the door, putting as much space as possible between himself and the Duke. The leather seats were cold. The air conditioning was humming quietly. Rowan shivered, pulling his thin tweed coat tighter around his shoulders. He felt ridiculous. He was supposed to be a newlywed. Henry was scrolling through a tablet, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light. He didn't glance up. He didn't speak. He just sat there, a monolith of cold efficiency, smelling sharply of crushed juniper and ozone. It was a clean scent, sterile, utterly detached. Rowan closed his eyes and leaned his head against the window. The cold glass felt good against his skin. He was tired. a bone-deep, marrow-sucking exhaustion that had been building for months. He had spent the last year dodging debt collectors, eating half meals, and taking cheap, over-the-counter suppressants that ravaged his immune system. Now, he was safe from the debt, but trapped in a different kind of cage. "Turn the climate control up," Henry's voice broke the silence. Rowan jumped slightly, opening his eyes. "Sir?" the driver asked through the intercom. "It's freezing in here, Davis. Turn the heat up and turn off the vents in the back." "Right away, Your Grace." A moment later, warm air began to flood the cabin. The chill against the window slowly dissipated. Rowan looked over at Henry. The Alpha was still looking at his tablet. He hadn't so much as shifted his posture. Rowan swallowed hard. "Thank you," he murmured. Henry didn't acknowledge it. He just kept reading. Rowan turned back to the window, watching the rain blur the city lights. His chest hurt a little less. The warmth was seeping through his damp coat, loosening the tight knots in his shoulders. It was a small thing, a simple adjustment of a dial, but it was the first time in a very long time that someone had noticed he was cold. The Somerset estate was less a home and more a fortress. It sat on 2,000 acres of rolling, mist-choked land in the north. The main house was a sprawling structure of dark stone and ivy, rising out of the landscape like a natural rock formation. When the car finally rolled to a stop in the circular driveway, the sun had already set. The rain had turned to a fine, freezing drizzle. The front doors opened before they even reached the top of the steps. A line of staff waited in the grand foyer, standing in perfect, silent attention. Rowan felt a fresh wave of nausea hit him. He hated being perceived. He hated the weight of expectation. He knew exactly what they saw: a pale, gaunt young man with dark bags under his eyes, wearing clothes that had been out of style a decade ago. The Duke's charity case. "Dismissed," Henry said as he walked through the doors. He didn't even break his stride. "Take his bag to the East Wing." A man in a sharp gray suit, the estate manager presumably, stepped forward and smoothly lifted Rowan's battered duffel from his hands. Rowan flinched, instinctively reaching to take it back, but stopped himself. "Welcome to Somerset, sir," the man said softly. "I am Thompson. If you require anything, you need only ask." "Oh, thank you," Rowan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry was already halfway up the grand staircase. He paused, looking back down. "Thompson, have dinner brought to the small dining room in an hour. Tell Mrs. Gable to keep it simple." "Yes, Your Grace." Henry looked at Rowan. "Your rooms are in the East Wing. Mine are in the West. Thompson will show you the way. Wash up, rest. I expect you for dinner." It wasn't a request. Rowan followed Thompson through a labyrinth of hallways. The house was immaculate, decorated in heavy woods, rich leathers, and muted colors. It felt sterile. There were no photographs, no personal touches, just expensive art and centuries of accumulated wealth. His suite was massive. A sitting room, a bedroom with a 4-poster bed large enough to sleep 6, and a bathroom entirely clad in gray marble. A fire was already roaring in the hearth. "Your luggage has been placed in the dressing room, sir," Thompson said, hovering by the door. "Shall I have someone draw a bath?" "No," Rowan said quickly. "No, thank you. I can manage." "Very well. Dinner is in 50 minutes. When the door clicked shut, Rowan sagged against it. His legs felt like lead. He walked into the bathroom and stared at himself in the mirror. He looked awful. His skin was translucent, stretching tight over his cheekbones. His mousy brown hair was damp and limp. He stripped off his clothes, shivering violently despite the warmth of the room, and stepped into the shower. He scrubbed himself until his skin was red, trying to wash away the smell of the city, the smell of the solicitor's office, the lingering anxiety. 50 minutes later, he sat across from Henry at a long mahogany table in a smaller but still imposing dining room. The silence was deafening. The only sounds were the clinking of heavy silver cutlery against porcelain and the crackle of the fireplace. Rowan stared at his plate. It was a beautiful piece of roasted pheasant, accompanied by glazed root vegetables and a rich dark reduction. It smelled incredible. It was probably worth more than he spent on groceries in a month. He couldn't eat a bite. His stomach, shrunken from months of starvation diets and knotted tightly with anxiety, physically rebelled at the thought of rich food. He picked up his fork. He cut a tiny piece of meat. He chewed it. It felt like ash in his mouth. He swallowed, forcing it down with a large gulp of water. Henry was eating with mechanical efficiency. He didn't look up, but Rowan felt the intense oppressive weight of the alpha's presence. It was a suffocating pressure in the room, prickling at the back of Rowan's neck. Rowan set his fork down. His hands were shaking again. He placed them in his lap, gripping his own thighs to steady them. He took a slow breath. He just had to sit here. He just had to pretend. "Is the food not to your liking?" Rowan jerked. Henry was looking at him. Those flat gray eyes were fixed on Rowan's face. "No!" Rowan stammered. "I mean, yes, it's fine. It's wonderful. I'm just not very hungry." Henry set his knife and fork down. The sound was unnervingly loud. He leaned back in his chair, assessing Rowan. His gaze dropped to Rowan's plate, then back to Rowan's pale face, taking in the hollow cheeks and the slight tremble in Rowan's shoulders. "You look like a stiff breeze would snap you in half," Henry said bluntly. Rowan flushed. Defensive anger flared briefly in his chest, overriding his fear. "I apologize for my appearance. It wasn't exactly a priority." Henry didn't react to the bite in Rowan's tone. He simply reached out and pressed a small silver button on the table. Seconds later, Thompson appeared. "Take this away," Henry instructed, gesturing to Rowan's plate. "Tell Mrs. Gable to make a clear chicken broth and bring some plain toast, white bread, no butter." Thompson nodded smoothly, removing the untouched plate. Rowan stared at Henry, utterly bewildered. "You didn't have to do that. I'm fine." "You're not fine," Henry stated calmly. "Your stomach cannot handle rich fats. You're severely underweight and likely suffering from malnourishment. Forcing down roasted game will only make you sick, and I have no desire to deal with a vomiting Omega on my first night home." The words were harsh, pragmatic, completely lacking in empathy. Yet the action behind them, the immediate, precise adjustment to Rowan's physical needs, left Rowan entirely speechless. 10 minutes later, Thompson returned with a steaming bowl of golden broth and 2 slices of dry toast. "Eat," Henry commanded, picking up his own knife and resuming his meal. Rowan looked at the broth. It smelled simple, safe. His mouth watered. He picked up his spoon and took a sip. It was warm, salty, and incredibly soothing on his raw throat. He ate the entire bowl and both pieces of toast. When he finished, he looked up to find Henry watching him again. "Better?" Henry asked. Rowan nodded slowly. "Yes, thank you." "Good. Go to sleep. You look terrible." It was a dismissal. Rowan stood up, excused himself, and navigated the quiet halls back to the east wing. When he finally crawled into the massive bed, the sheets felt obscenely soft against his skin. The heavy knot in his chest had loosened just a fraction. Henry Caldwell was a cold man, but as Rowan drifted off to sleep, his stomach full and comfortably warm for the first time in years, he thought that perhaps the Duke's particular brand of ice wasn't meant to freeze him out, but to preserve him. The fever hit 3 days later. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow, creeping rot that started deep in Rowan's bones. He should have expected it. The adrenaline crash following the wedding, the sudden shift from a damp, freezing flat to a temperature-controlled manor, and the abrupt cessation of the cheap suppressants he could no longer hide or acquire. His body was rebelling. It was purging years of neglect all at once. He spent the first 2 days wandering the East Wing like a ghost. He read in the library. He stared out the massive bay windows at the relentless northern rain. He only saw Henry at dinner, where they exchanged perhaps 5 words in total. The broth had transitioned to shredded chicken and rice, then to soft-boiled eggs. Always simple, always exactly what his stomach could handle. On the 3rd afternoon, Rowan didn't make it out of bed. His skin felt like it was coated in ground glass. Every joint ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. He lay curled under the heavy down duvet, shivering so violently his teeth clicked together. His head pounded in time with his erratic heartbeat. He was supposed to be at lunch. He knew the schedule now. 1 o'clock, sharp. It was 1:15. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled and gave out. He collapsed back against the pillows, gasping for air. The room was spinning. His scent, usually so suppressed and hidden, was spiking wildly in distress, filling the room with the sharp, bitter tang of burnt chamomile and sour honey. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Get up," he told himself. "Get up or he'll think you're lazy. He'll think you're ungrateful. He'll send you back." The thought of going back to the debt collectors, to his father's drunken rages, spiked his panic. His breathing hitched, turning into shallow, ragged pants. The door to his suite clicked open. Rowan froze. He couldn't hear footsteps on the thick carpet, but he could feel the shift in the air pressure. A heavy, dense wave of ozone and crushed juniper rolled into the room, swallowing his panicked scent whole. Henry. "Rowan." The voice was low, demanding. It wasn't a question. Rowan tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. He managed to pry his eyes open just as Henry stepped into his line of sight. The Alpha was still wearing his riding clothes, tall leather boots, breeches, a dark sweater that stretched across his broad chest. He looked massive from this angle. He looked terrifying. Henry stepped up to the edge of the bed. His jaw was clenched tight. He looked down at Rowan, taking in the sweat matting the Omega's hair to his forehead, the violent shivering, the flushed, fever-bright cheeks. "Why didn't you ring for someone?" Henry demanded. His voice cracked like a whip in the quiet room. Rowan flinched, shrinking back against the headboard. I'm sorry, I just needed a minute. I'll get up." He tried to push the covers off, his hands shaking uselessly. "Stop being an idiot," Henry snapped. He reached out. Rowan squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for a rough hand, a pull, a reprimand. Instead, a large, calloused palm pressed flat against his forehead. The contrast was shocking. Henry's hand was cool, dry, and incredibly steady. Rowan gasped at the contact, the touch searing through his fevered haze. He went entirely still. "You're burning up," Henry muttered. He didn't move his hand. He kept it there, his thumb resting lightly against Rowan's temple. Rowan couldn't breathe. The sheer proximity of the Alpha, the intense suffocating smell of his pheromones, was overwhelming. It wasn't aggressive. It was heavy, protective. It was the scent of a predator circling its den, shutting down any external threat. Henry pulled his hand back, and Rowan instantly mourned the loss of the cool contact. Henry turned his head toward the open door. "Thompson!" he roared. The sheer volume vibrated in Rowan's chest. Footsteps hurried down the hall. Thompson appeared in the doorway, looking mildly alarmed. "Your Grace?" "Call Dr. Eris. Tell him to get here immediately. Have Mrs. Gable boil water and bring up cold compresses. Now." "Right away, sir." Thompson vanished. Henry turned back to Rowan. He didn't say anything. He just reached down and gathered the edges of the heavy duvet, tucking them tighter around Rowan's shivering frame. His movements were blunt, lacking any practiced gentleness, but they were incredibly precise. "I'm sorry," Rowan whispered. A tear slipped hot and fast down his cheek. He hated this. He hated being weak. He hated that this intimidating, silent man had to deal with his broken body. "I'm sorry, I'm defective. I know I am." Henry stopped moving. His hands rested on either side of Rowan's shoulders, braced against the mattress. He leaned down, his face inches from Rowan's. His gray eyes were entirely black, blown wide with alpha instinct. "Do not ever say that word again," Henry said. The rumble of his voice was deep, vibrating straight into Rowan's bones. "You are my husband. You live under my roof, my protection. You are not defective. You are sick, and you will get better." Rowan stared at him, his breath catching in his throat. Henry straightened up. He pulled a wooden chair from the corner of the room and dragged it next to the bed. It scraped harshly against the floorboards. He sat down, crossing his arms over his chest. "What are you doing?" Rowan rasped. "Waiting for the doctor," Henry replied. He didn't look at Rowan. He stared straight ahead at the wall. "You don't have to stay." Henry shifted his gaze, pinning Rowan with a look of absolute, immovable stubbornness. "I am perfectly aware of what I have to do, Rowan. Close your eyes. Go to sleep." Rowan closed his eyes. The fever was raging, making his thoughts spin, but the oppressive, terrifying fear that had gripped him for days was gone. The air in the room was saturated with the smell of juniper and winter storms. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. But as Rowan finally let go, sinking into the dark pull of sleep, he realized it didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like an anchor. Recovery was an ugly, humiliating process. Rowan spent 4 days drifting in and out of consciousness, his body violently expelling the toxins of cheap suppressants. He threw up. He sweat through the expensive linen sheets. He cried out in his sleep from muscle cramps that locked his calves and spine. Through it all there was the doctor, an older beta named Eris who smelled of rubbing alcohol and peppermint. And there was Thompson, appearing with cold cloths and glasses of electrolyte water. But beneath it all, laying the foundation of the room's atmosphere, was the heavy, unyielding scent of juniper and ozone. Henry didn't hover. He wasn't a nursemaid. But whenever Rowan woke from a fever dream, gasping and disoriented, he found the alpha sitting in the wooden chair in the corner. Sometimes Henry was reading a leather-bound ledger. Sometimes he was on his phone typing terse emails. He never offered empty words of comfort. If Rowan asked for water, Henry poured it. If Rowan shivered, Henry threw another log on the fire. It was purely mechanical, yet it anchored Rowan to reality. On the 5th morning, the fever finally broke. Rowan woke up to silence. The heavy curtains were drawn back, revealing a pale, watery northern sun. His body felt hollowed out, weak and entirely drained, but the agonizing pain was gone. He took a deep breath. His own scent had settled. The sour distress was gone, replaced by the faint, dry aroma of old paper and chamomile. He sat up slowly. The room was empty. The wooden chair was pushed back into its corner. An hour later, after a slow, exhausting shower, Rowan ventured into the sitting room of his suite. A small table had been set up by the window. On it was a pot of tea, a bowl of oatmeal, and a small stack of thick cream-colored envelopes. Thompson appeared silently from the hallway. "Good morning, sir. It is good to see you on your feet." "Thank you, Thompson," Rowan rasped. His throat was still dry. "Who are the letters from?" "Dr. Eris left a dietary schedule," Thompson said, stepping forward to pour the tea. "The rest are internal estate memos. His Grace requested you be copied on all household affairs." Rowan blinked, confused. "Why? You are the Duke's consort. This is your home." Thompson handed him the tea. It was perfectly steeped, warm, and slightly sweetened with honey. "His Grace also left instructions regarding your wardrobe. A tailor will arrive on Tuesday to measure you for proper winter clothing. Until then, he suggests you remain indoors." Rowan stared at the oatmeal. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an edict. He spent the next 3 days confined to the East Wing, eating precisely what was brought to him. He read the memos. They were mundane. Roof repairs on the west barn, a dispute with a tenant farmer over grazing boundaries, the quarterly budget for the kitchen staff. Henry was giving him a job. It was a brilliant, pragmatic move. Rowan was a man used to surviving on his wits, navigating his father's debts, balancing checkbooks that were always overdrawn. Being given access to the household operations wasn't a romantic gesture. It was Henry recognizing a skill set. It kept Rowan's mind sharp while his body healed. It gave him a purpose that didn't involve just sitting around waiting to be an Omega. When Rowan finally saw Henry again, it was in the main study on the ground floor. Rowan knocked lightly on the heavy oak door. "Enter!" Henry's voice rumbled. Rowan pushed the door open. The study was massive, lined with books from floor to ceiling. Henry was sitting behind a massive desk, surrounded by paperwork. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing thick, corded muscle and a faint, jagged scar running down his left wrist. Henry looked up. His gray eyes swept over Rowan, cataloging the changes. The hollows in Rowan's cheeks were less pronounced. His skin had lost its translucent pallor. "You're out of bed," Henry stated. "I am," Rowan said, stepping further into the room. He felt small in the massive space, but the crushing anxiety that usually accompanied his interactions with alphas was surprisingly absent. "I wanted to thank you, for the doctor, and for putting up with all of that." "You were ill. You required medical attention. There's nothing to thank me for." Henry picked up his pen. "Have you reviewed the kitchen budgets?" Rowan blinked at the abrupt subject change. "Yes, I have." "And?" Rowan walked up to the desk. "Mrs. Gable is overspending on imported out-of-season produce. If she utilized the root cellars and the estate's own winter harvest, you could cut the grocery expenditure by 14% without compromising the nutritional value of the meals." Henry stopped writing. He didn't look up immediately. Then a small, barely perceptible huff of air escaped his nose. It was the closest thing to a laugh Rowan had ever heard from him. 14%, Henry repeated. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Draft a memo to Thompson detailing the changes. Implement it by Monday." Rowan felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest. "Yes, Your Grace." "Henry," the Alpha corrected smoothly. He went back to his paperwork. "If you are going to manage my house, you will address me by my name." Rowan swallowed. "Henry." The Alpha didn't respond, but the heavy scent of juniper in the room seemed to soften, losing its sharp, territorial edge. Rowan turned and walked out of the study, his spine a little straighter. The contract had bought his submission, yes, but it seemed Henry was entirely uninterested in keeping him on his knees. By the second week, Rowan was restless. The tailor had come and gone, leaving behind a wardrobe of thick wool sweaters, tailored trousers, and soft cashmere cardigans that felt like armor against the biting chill of the manor. His body was steadily gaining weight. His scent was no longer a marker of sickness, but a steady, quiet hum in the background. He began to explore. Somerset was a museum of cold stone and historical tapestries, but behind the west wing, hidden behind a tall yew hedge, Rowan found a sprawling Victorian glass house. The iron framework was painted a deep, rust-resistant green. The glass panels were slightly fogged with condensation. Rowan pushed open the heavy brass-handled door and was instantly hit by a wall of humid, earthy warmth. It smelled of wet soil, crushed leaves, and the sharp, bright tang of citrus. He walked down the central aisle, marveling at the dense foliage. Monstera plants the size of small cars, rows of delicate orchids, lemon trees heavy with yellow fruit. It was a pocket of absolute vibrant life in the middle of a frozen wasteland. "Don't touch the belladonna!" Rowan jumped, his heart spiking. He spun around. Henry was kneeling at the end of a row of raised beds. He was wearing an old canvas jacket over a worn t-shirt, his hands buried deep in dark potting soil. A smudge of dirt streaked across his jawline. He looked entirely out of place, yet completely in his element. Rowan took a step back, instinctively checking his own scent, making sure he wasn't projecting fear. "I didn't know you were in here. I apologize." Henry patted the soil down around a small green chute. "This is a private estate, Rowan. You don't need to apologize for walking through a door." He stood up, wiping his hands on a rough towel hanging from a nearby bench. He looked at Rowan. The Omega was wearing one of the new, oversized beige cardigans. It swamped his frame, but the color brought out the subtle gold flecks in his brown eyes. "You like plants?" Henry asked. "I like the heat," Rowan answered honestly. He crossed his arms, hugging the soft wool to his chest. "It's freezing in the rest of the house." Henry walked over to a small cast-iron sink and turned on the tap, washing the dirt from his hands. "The stone holds the cold. It's centuries old. We rely on the fires." He turned the tap off and dried his hands. "My mother built this glass house. She was an Omega from southern Italy. She hated the English winters. Rowan watched him. It was the most Henry had ever spoken at one time. It was the first piece of personal history he had offered. Did it help? Rowan asked quietly. No, Henry said bluntly. He leaned against the sink, crossing his arms over his chest. His gray eyes were fixed on the glass ceiling, watching the rain beat against the panes. She died of pneumonia when I was 6. But the plants survived. Rowan didn't offer pity. He knew from experience that pity was a useless, patronizing currency. He looked around the thriving green space. You kept it running? It requires maintenance, Henry replied, his voice devoid of sentiment. A poorly maintained estate is a sign of a weak alpha. I don't tolerate weakness. The words hung in the humid air. Rowan felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. I don't tolerate weakness. He was the definition of weakness. A bought and paid for Omega with a fragile body and a ruined family name. Rowan met Henry's gaze. Then why did you buy me? The question was out before he could stop it. It was the cynical, ugly truth of their marriage, laid bare beneath the lemon trees. Henry didn't flinch. He didn't look away. The air pressure in the greenhouse shifted, the scent of juniper growing dense, mixing with the smell of wet earth. Because I needed a husband to satisfy the board of trustees, and I don't have the time or the patience for courting, Henry said. His voice was entirely factual. I looked at a dozen dossiers. They were all young, healthy, ambitious Omegas from good families. They wanted high society. They wanted galas. They wanted me to pretend to be a romantic. Henry stepped away from the sink, closing the distance between them until he was standing just a few feet away. Rowan held his ground, though every instinct told him to step back. I saw your file, Henry continued. You were drowning in debt. You were starving yourself to afford suppressants. You were surviving. I didn't want a socialite, Rowan. I wanted someone who understood the value of a transaction. I give you security, a home, and the best medical care money can buy. You give me a ring on my finger and quiet in my house. Rowan stared at him. The bluntness was staggering. There was no pretense, no sugarcoating. It was a brutal assessment of his worth, yet strangely it felt liberating. Rowan didn't have to perform. He didn't have to pretend to be a blushing bride. Henry saw exactly what he was, a survivor of a shipwreck, and simply offered him a dry deck to stand on. I see, Rowan said softly. Henry reached out. Rowan didn't flinch this time. Henry's large, rough hand reached past Rowan's shoulder and plucked a perfectly ripe lemon from the tree behind him. The kitchen uses these, Henry said, handing the lemon to Rowan. The bright yellow skin was a stark contrast to Henry's scarred hand. Tell Mrs. Gable to stop buying the imported ones. It ruins your budget. Rowan looked down at the fruit in his hands, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. I will. Henry nodded once, turned, and walked back to his potting bench. The conversation was over, but as Rowan walked back to the main house, the heavy lemon resting in his pocket, he realized that a glass house wasn't just built to trap heat. It was built to protect fragile things until they were strong enough to take root. The peace lasted exactly 3 weeks. It shattered on a Tuesday evening with the arrival of Charles Caldwell, Henry's cousin. Charles was a beta who desperately wished he were an alpha. He was loud, impeccably dressed in overly trendy suits, and smelled artificially of expensive cologne designed to mimic dominance. He was a board member of the Caldwell Holding Company. He was also, prior to Rowan's arrival, next in line for the dukedom should Henry die without an heir or a spouse. Rowan hated him immediately. Dinner was agonizing. They were in the main dining hall, a cavernous room that swallowed sound. Charles sat to Henry's right, Rowan to Henry's left. I must admit, Henry, Charles said, swirling a glass of dark red wine, when you announced you had finally married, I expected someone a bit more robust. Charles's eyes slid over to Rowan. The beta's gaze was slimy, dissecting Rowan's slim frame, his simple gray sweater, the distinct lack of a powerful, intoxicating Omega scent. Rowan kept his eyes on his plate. He carefully cut a piece of roasted chicken. He didn't engage. He had spent his entire life shrinking under the scrutiny of men like Charles. Henry didn't look up from his meal. "Rowan's health is improving. Is it?" Charles chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "He looks like a stiff wind would blow him over the moors. The society papers are having a field day, you know. The Duke's charity case, they're calling him. A desperate Omega from a disgraced family. Your father must be rolling in the family crypt." Rowan's hand tightened around his knife. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. The familiar, suffocating grip of shame washed over him. His scent, usually so quiet, flared with a spike of sour anxiety. He waited for Henry to agree. He waited for Henry to tell Charles the truth, that it was a transaction, a business deal to keep Charles away from the estate. Henry set his cutlery down. The sound echoed loudly against the stone walls. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Henry slowly turned his head to look at Charles. The Alpha's face was utterly blank. It was a terrifying absence of expression. His pale gray eyes were flat, dead voids. Suddenly, a wave of pheromones slammed into the room. Rowan gasped, dropping his knife. It wasn't the heavy protective blanket of juniper he was used to. This was violent. It was the scent of snapping frost, of a blizzard tearing through a forest, stripping bark from trees. It was pure, unadulterated alpha dominance, weaponized and aimed directly across the table. Charles choked. The beta actually gagged, dropping his wine glass. It shattered against the table, the red liquid pooling on the white linen. Charles gripped the edge of the table, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray as he struggled to breathe under the crushing atmospheric pressure. "You will not." Henry's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a physical blow. "Speak of my husband in that manner. You will not insult my house, and you will never, under any circumstances, distress him in my presence again." Charles couldn't speak. He was physically pinned to his chair by the sheer biological force of Henry's wrath. He managed a jerky, terrified nod. Henry held his gaze for 3 agonizing seconds longer. Then he blinked. The crushing pressure vanished in an instant. The room was just a room again. Charles slumped forward, gasping for air, sweating profusely through his expensive suit. Henry picked up his napkin, calmly wiped his mouth, and tossed it onto the table. "Thompson," he said, not raising his voice. The estate manager stepped out of the shadows by the door. "Yes, Your Grace." "Have Charles's driver bring his car around immediately. He's leaving." "But, Henry, the roads are icing over." Charles wheezed, his bravado entirely gone, replaced by raw fear. "Then I suggest you drive carefully," Henry said. He stood up. He didn't look at Charles again. He walked around the table to Rowan's side. Rowan was trembling. He was clutching the edge of the table, wide-eyed, his own breath coming in shallow gasps. He had never witnessed an alpha exert that kind of raw biological power. It was terrifying. Henry stopped next to Rowan's chair. He didn't touch him. He simply stood there, an immovable wall of dark wool and quiet strength. The violent blizzard scent was gone. The heavy, safe smell of juniper and ozone slowly seeped back into the air, wrapping around Rowan's anxious, sour scent and smothering it into submission. "Come," Henry said quietly. Rowan let go of the table. His legs were shaky, but he stood up. He didn't look at Charles as they walked out of the dining room. They walked in silence down the grand hallway, heading toward the east wing. Rowan's heart was still racing, a chaotic mix of residual fear and something entirely new, a fierce burning warmth in his chest. When they reached the door to Rowan's suite, Henry stopped. Rowan looked up at him. The Alpha's jaw was still tight, a faint muscle ticking near his ear. "I'm sorry," Rowan blurted out. Henry frowned. "For what?" "For causing a scene. For my scent. I couldn't control it. I know I embarrassed you." Henry stepped closer. He reached out, his large hand brushing against the collar of Rowan's cardigan. The touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the violence he had just displayed. "You did not embarrass me," Henry said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. "You are my Omega. Anyone who questions your place in this house answers to me. Do you understand?" Rowan swallowed hard. The cynical transactional boundaries they had established in the greenhouse felt suddenly very thin, melting away under the intense protective weight of Henry's gaze. "Yes," Rowan whispered. Henry held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good night, Rowan." He turned and walked away, heading toward the west wing. Rowan stood in the doorway, watching the broad line of the Duke's shoulders until he disappeared into the shadows. Rowan touched his own chest, right over his racing heart. It wasn't a cage. It wasn't just a dry deck to stand on. It was a fortress. And for the first time in his life, Rowan was on the inside, while the monsters were locked out. December arrived not with a whisper, but a roar. A massive front of Arctic air settled over the estate, burying the grounds in 3 feet of dense, unyielding snow. The roads were impassable. The sprawling stone manor became an island. For the first time in his life, Rowan did not fear the cold. His body had changed. The hollows of his cheeks had filled in. His skin, once translucent and papery, now held a healthy, grounded flush. The tailored wool sweaters no longer swallowed him. They fit properly across his strengthening shoulders. And his scent, once a sour, dusty marker of starvation, had blossomed into something warm. It smelled of steeped chamomile, baked apples, and old sun-warmed paper. He was managing the household. It wasn't an official title, but Thompson and Mrs. Gable deferred to him on everything from the winter rationing to the heating schedules. Rowan was efficient. He found a quiet satisfaction in balancing the massive ledgers, stretching budgets, and ensuring the staff was comfortable during the freeze. Henry, however, was wearing thin. The Duke had been locked in his study for 3 days. The end-of-year audits for the Caldwell holdings were brutal, and the snowstorm had knocked out the main satellite internet for the estate. Henry was forced to do everything via a crackling landline and stacks of physical paperwork brought in by courier just before the roads closed. It was near midnight on a Thursday. Rowan was in the library, reading by the fire, when the heavy oak door clicked open. He looked up. Henry stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was gone, the top 3 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked exhausted. The sharp, clean scent of juniper and ozone was muffled, soured slightly by the sharp tang of stress and black coffee. Henry didn't say anything. He just looked at Rowan. He walked over to one of the leather armchairs opposite the sofa where Rowan was curled up. He sat down heavily, leaning his head back and closing his eyes. He pinched the bridge of his nose. Rowan marked his page and set his book down. The silence stretched. The only sound was the crackle of the birch logs in the hearth and the muffled howl of the wind outside the frosted windows. "Migraine?" Rowan asked softly. Henry grunted, a single, tight syllable of affirmation. "The numbers are blurring. The phone lines are down again. It is a logistical nightmare." Rowan watched him. 3 months ago, he would have bolted from the room, terrified of a stressed, volatile alpha. Now, he simply stood up. He walked over to the small drinks cart in the corner. He bypassed the expensive scotch and poured a glass of room-temperature water. He walked back and stood beside Henry's chair. "Drink," Rowan said. Henry opened one eye. He looked at the water, then up at Rowan. He took the glass and drained it in a single swallow, handing it back. He closed his eyes again, his jaw clenching against the pounding in his skull. Rowan didn't walk away. Instinct, buried deep and entirely unpracticed, flared to life in his chest. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a biological response to the alpha's distress. Rowan took a step closer, moving until his knees brushed the edge of Henry's chair. He reached out. His fingers, now steady and warm, found the tight, knotted muscles at the base of Henry's neck. Henry went entirely rigid. A low, warning rumble started deep in his chest, an automatic alpha reflex against being touched from behind when vulnerable. Rowan didn't retreat. He pressed firmer, his thumbs digging into the hard cord of muscle where Henry's neck met his shoulders. At the same time, Rowan let his scent drop. He stopped policing it, stopped holding it close to his skin. He let the warm, heavy aroma of baked apples and chamomile wash over the chair, a thick, soothing blanket designed to calm the nervous system. "Breathe, Henry," Rowan murmured. Henry inhaled sharply. The scent hit him. The rigid tension in his spine snapped. With a heavy exhale, the massive alpha slumped forward slightly, giving himself over to Rowan's hands. The low rumble in his chest shifted from a warning to something entirely different, a deep, resonant purr of absolute submission to the Omega's touch. Rowan's heart hammered a frantic rhythm, but his hands remained steady. He worked the knots out of Henry's neck, moving his fingers up into the short, coarse hair at the nape. He could feel the exact moment the migraine began to recede. Henry's breathing slowed, matching the cadence of Rowan's own. They stayed like that for 20 minutes. The storm raged outside. Inside, the world shrank to the heat of the fire and the rhythm of Rowan's hands. Finally, Henry reached up. He caught Rowan's right hand, halting the massage. His grip was firm, but impossibly gentle. Henry didn't let go. He brought Rowan's hand around, resting his forehead against Rowan's knuckles for a long, silent moment. His breathing was deep and even. "Thank you." Henry's voice was a rough gravel scrape in the quiet room. He turned his head slightly, pressing his lips to the center of Rowan's palm. The kiss was brief, dry, searing hot. Rowan stopped breathing. Henry let go of his hand, stood up, and looked down at him. The flat gray eyes weren't dead anymore. They were dark, entirely focused, and burning with a quiet, terrifying intensity. "Go to sleep, Rowan," Henry said. He turned and walked out of the library. Rowan stood rooted to the spot, his hand burning where the alpha's lips had touched, his chest aching with a violent, sudden realization. He was no longer just surviving. He was falling rapidly and completely for a man made of ice who was slowly melting just for him. The Pampered treatment began subtly. It was a gradual, insidious shift that Rowan almost missed until he was entirely surrounded by it. It started with the food. Mrs. Gable, under strict orders from the Duke, no longer served Rowan the simple, utilitarian meals meant to rebuild his stomach. Breakfast became an event. Trays arrived with perfectly poached eggs, thick cuts of smoked salmon, fresh berries imported at ridiculous expense, and pastries baked at dawn. Then it was the environment. Rowan casually mentioned one afternoon that the east wing felt a bit drafty when the wind blew from the moors. The next morning, a team of contractors arrived. They spent 3 days insulating the walls, installing heated floorboards under the thick carpets, and replacing the heavy drapes with thermal-lined velvet. Rowan tried to protest. "This is entirely unnecessary," he told Thompson as men drilled into the masonry. "I have sweaters. I'm fine." Thompson offered a polite, practiced smile. "His Grace was very specific, sir. The east wing is not to drop below 21 degrees. Would you care for some tea while the noise continues?" The final straw arrived on a Tuesday in late January. Rowan was in the glass house, watering a row of delicate ferns, when Henry walked in. The alpha was holding a flat, rectangular box wrapped in dark blue paper. "For you," Henry said, holding it out. Rowan wiped his damp hands on his trousers and took it cautiously. "It's not my birthday." "I'm aware," Henry replied, crossing his arms and leaning against the iron framework of the glass house. "Open it." Rowan peeled back the paper. Inside was a sleek, matte black e-reader. But it wasn't just the device. Taped to the back was a heavy embossed card from an exclusive London antiquarian book dealer. It was a receipt for a massive, unhindered line of credit. "Henry," Rowan breathed, staring at the numbers. I can't accept this. This is thousands of pounds." "You depleted the library's fiction section 3 weeks ago," Henry stated calmly. "I noticed you were rereading a Dickens novel you clearly didn't enjoy. You require new material. And since the roads are still treacherous, physical books are delayed." Rowan looked up. "I can just order them on a normal account, or borrow them." You don't need to buy me an open tab at a rare book dealer. The contract... Rowan trailed off, swallowing the sudden lump in his throat. The contract doesn't require this. Henry's expression darkened. The scent of juniper flared, sharp and dominant, immediately filling the humid space. He pushed off the iron frame and closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Rowan instinctively stepped back, his back hitting a wooden potting bench. Henry stopped inches away. He reached out, his large hands gripping the edges of the bench on either side of Rowan's hips, effectively caging him in. The alpha leaned down. "I am sick to death of hearing about that piece of paper," Henry said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, vibrating baritone. Rowan clutched the box to his chest. "It's the only reason I'm here." "It is the reason you arrived," Henry corrected harshly. "It is not the reason you remain." Rowan's breath hitched. "Then why?" Henry stared at him. The sheer gravity of the alpha's presence was crushing, but there was no fear in Rowan's chest anymore. There was only a desperate, aching need to know the truth. "Because you belong to me," Henry said. It wasn't a romantic declaration, it was a territorial fact, spoken with absolute terrifying conviction. "You are my husband. You are my Omega. You manage my house. You calm my mind. I do not care about a contract drafted by a solicitor who smells of cheap gin. I care that you are warm. I care that you are fed. I care that you are not bored." Henry lifted one hand from the bench. He reached up, his rough thumb tracing the line of Rowan's jaw, resting lightly over the rapidly beating pulse in Rowan's throat. "I bought you," Henry murmured, the harshness fading from his voice, replaced by a heavy, raw possessiveness. "Because I required a transaction. I am keeping you because I have found something I refuse to let go of." Rowan's eyes fluttered shut at the touch. The scent of juniper and rain washed over him, completely erasing the smell of the damp earth and citrus. He leaned into Henry's hand. "You're spoiling me," Rowan whispered, his voice trembling. "I won't know how to survive if you stop." "I'm not going to stop," Henry promised. "I'm going to ruin you for anything else." Henry tilted Rowan's chin up. He didn't ask permission. He didn't hesitate. He brought his mouth down on Rowan's. It wasn't a gentle, testing kiss. It was deep, claiming, and entirely overwhelming. Henry tasted like black coffee and mint. His lips were firm, parting Rowan's with a practiced, immovable authority. Rowan gasped into his mouth, his hands dropping the box to grip the front of Henry's wool sweater. He kissed him back. All the pent-up fear, the anxiety, the desperate, lonely nights in his freezing London flat. It all poured out of him, melting into the heat of the alpha's mouth. Rowan pulled himself flush against Henry's chest, letting the sheer density of the man anchor him. When Henry finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily. The alpha's eyes were blown wide, completely black, his pupils swallowing the gray. "Pack your things," Henry commanded, his voice thick and rough. Rowan blinked, disoriented, his lips bruised and stinging in the best possible way. "What?" "The East Wing is too far," Henry said, his thumb brushing over Rowan's swollen lower lip. "You're moving into my suites. Tonight." The master suite in the West Wing was massive. It was an intimidating expanse of dark mahogany, heavy tapestries, and a bed that looked more like an altar. It smelled entirely of Henry. Rowan stood in the center of the room, holding his battered duffel bag. It was the same bag he had arrived with, but this time it held only a few personal items. Thompson and the staff had already moved his clothing, arranging his soft cardigans alongside Henry's sharp, tailored suits in the cavernous dressing room. Henry walked in behind him. He took the duffel bag from Rowan's hands and tossed it onto a nearby chair. "Are you nervous?" Henry asked. Rowan turned around. "Yes." Henry nodded. He appreciated honesty. He walked over to a heavy sideboard and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He offered it to Rowan. "Drink this. It will settle your nerves." Rowan took it, sipping the fiery whiskey. It burned a path down his throat, pooling warmly in his stomach. Henry unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling his sleeves up. I'm not going to hurt you, Rowan, but I am not a gentleman by nature. If I'm too heavy, or if you need me to stop, you tell me, immediately. Is that understood? The blunt, pragmatic communication was so profoundly Henry that Rowan actually smiled. The anxiety that had been buzzing in his veins quieted down. This wasn't a performance. It was just them. I understand, Rowan said, setting the empty glass down. He took a step forward. He reached out and placed his hands flat against Henry's chest. The Alpha's heart was hammering, a heavy, rhythmic thud against Rowan's palms. Henry wasn't as calm as he pretended to be. Rowan looked up into those pale, fierce eyes. I don't want you to be gentle. I want you to be mine. A low groan tore from Henry's throat. His restraint, held together by sheer willpower for months, shattered entirely. He wrapped his massive arms around Rowan, lifting him entirely off the floor. Rowan gasped as his feet left the carpet, instinctively wrapping his legs around the Alpha's waist. Henry carried him across the room in 3 strides, dropping him onto the massive bed. The mattress swallowed Rowan. Before he could even bounce back, Henry was over him, a heavy, smothering blanket of heat and muscle. The scent in the room turned dense, practically suffocating. It was the smell of a winter storm breaking, lightning striking the pines. Rowan opened his own scent completely, letting the warm, sweet honey and baked apple flood the air, inviting the storm in. Henry buried his face in the crook of Rowan's neck. He inhaled deeply, dragging his nose against the sensitive scent gland there. Rowan arched his back, a sharp cry escaping his lips as Henry's teeth scraped lightly against his skin. Mine, Henry rumbled, the vibration traveling directly into Rowan's skin. The clothing was dealt with efficiently, discarded onto the floor. When skin finally met skin, Rowan realized just how deprived he had been. Henry was a furnace. Every slide of his calloused hands, every pressing weight of his chest, grounded Rowan, tethering him to reality. It was a total surrender, not just of the body, but of the defenses they had both built. Henry was demanding, territorial, and incredibly thorough. He touched Rowan not like a fragile, broken thing, but like something precious and vital that he was claiming ownership over. When the pain gave way to a blinding, agonizing pleasure, Rowan sobbed, his hands clutching desperately at Henry's broad back. He dug his nails in, wanting to anchor the man to him permanently, and when the peak hit, breaking over them in a tidal wave of biological and emotional exhaustion, Henry didn't pull away. He shifted his weight, his jaw finding that soft, pulsing spot on Rowan's neck. "Rowan!" Henry gasped, a ragged, desperate sound. "Do it!" Rowan cried, holding the Alpha's head tight against him. "Please, Henry!" Henry bit down. The pain was sharp, piercing through the haze of pleasure, but it was immediately followed by a rush of endorphins so powerful Rowan's vision swam. The bonding mark, the physical manifestation of an Alpha's claim and an Omega's acceptance, locked into place. Rowan felt the rush of Henry's emotions flood through the new bond. It wasn't cold, it wasn't transactional. It was a blinding, fiercely protective wall of absolute devotion. Henry loved him. The realization hit Rowan with the force of a physical blow, bringing a fresh wave of tears to his eyes. Much later, when the fire had burned down to embers, Rowan lay curled flush against Henry's side. The Alpha's heavy arm was draped protectively across Rowan's waist, anchoring him to the mattress. Rowan's neck ached where the fresh mark rested, a permanent badge of his place in this house. He traced the faint scar on Henry's wrist. "I'm not going back to the East Wing," Rowan whispered into the quiet room. Henry tightened his grip, pulling Rowan closer until their chests were pressed together. "If you try to leave this bed, I will nail the doors shut." Rowan smiled in the dark, pressing a soft kiss to the Alpha's collarbone. He closed his eyes, inhaling the deep, safe scent of juniper. He had arrived at Somerset as a purchase, a fragile, broken thing expecting to be frozen out. He had never expected the ice to melt. He had never expected to find a home in the center of the storm. But as he drifted off to sleep, wrapped in the arms of the most terrifying, unyielding man he had ever met, Rowan knew one thing for certain. He was never going to be cold again. If you love this story of Rowan and Henry's intense, emotional journey from a cold contract to a deeply devoted bond, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Hitting that notification bell ensures you won't miss any of the gripping, slow-burn Omegaverse dramas coming next. Your support helps bring more of these grounded, passionate stories to life. Drop a comment below, and thank you for listening.